There's a saying, democracy is for losers, which means a democracy only works if the person who loses is willing to concede the election and support the legitimacy, if not the policies, of the person who wins the election. Trump's understanding of the presidency is that the president is effectively an emperor. He has no respect for democratic norms, democratic customs, or the constraints that are in our laws and the constitutions. My name is Erica Newland. I was an attorney at the Department of Justice under Donald Trump, and now I work for Protect Democracy, where I try to protect our country from the authoritarian threat.
Erica Newland, to start with, tell me about your role when you were at the Department of Justice. What did you do? What was your focus?
I was at the Department of Justice from August of 2016 through November of 2018. And while I was there, I was an attorney advisor at the Office of Legal Counsel within the Justice Department. And my job was to review the policies and plans that were coming from our executive agencies and from the White House to ensure that they were lawful. The problem in the Trump administration was that the findings that were coming across our desk were not always accurate and sometimes reflected deep bigotries.
Can you give us an example of that?
So executive orders would come through about immigrant populations, or one that I didn't work on but that came through during my time at the Office of Legal Counsel was the Muslim ban, or the 3 iterations of the Muslim ban.
And tell me about sort of the misgivings you had about some of these executive orders.
The department was engaged in a policy of ripping children from their parents at the border. We know this as family separation. And there were multiple instances of presidential interference in the conduct of the department. Each of these represented to me a destruction of our norms. Some were technically lawful only because we helped make them so as attorneys at the department. And in that sense, I've come to feel that we were complicit in the destruction of the rule of law.
While you were working on these executive orders
Yes.
coming out of the administration or the Oval Office itself, you must have felt very conflicted.
Oh, yes. When I was there and I was working on an order where I felt the substance was going to hurt people or harm people, or just the rhetoric that the president and the government were using were going to harm people, I was every day asking myself, am I doing enough to push back? How could I push harder? If I haven't been fired yet, then have I pushed hard enough? How can I fulfill my patriotic duty and what I owe to the American people? I felt honored to be able to help on behalf of the Department of Justice, but what I failed to fully recognize at the time was how good the administration was at co-opting the work that its lawyers were doing and using us to legitimize its lies. So when we were nipping and tucking at those orders to make them lawful, what we were also doing was helping perpetuate a form of misinformation, for example, about the threats that certain populations allegedly pose. One of the challenges that confronts department lawyers is how much are they representing the president in his official capacity versus how much are they representing him in his personal capacity. And the department's role is to represent him in his official capacity, but it is easy for those lines to get blurred. And this really crystallized for me actually a couple years after I left during the fights over the 2020 election results. You know, the way our laws work, the Department of Justice couldn't defend Trump, couldn't represent candidate Trump, and so campaign lawyers had to do the work. And the campaign lawyers were not as polished. They were frankly not as excellent of lawyers as the lawyers at the Department of Justice. And after 4 years of having Department of Justice lawyers do the president's dirty work for him, and really seeing his work stand up in court, once you had these kind of backbenchers having to represent his arguments, suddenly the courts weren't putting up with it anymore. And that really identified for me how much of that legitimizing we had been doing.
You wrote about complicity.
Yes.
You said we were complicit.
Yes.
How were you complicit?
I was helping an administration, a president, who did not have any concept of democracy, who did not have any respect for the law. There were times when I was at the department, we would hear the protests outside of our windows. In fact, I had colleagues from across the department who would sometimes go and join those protests. And I both admired them for joining and felt heartbroken that here I was working down the hall from the Attorney General of the United States. And the best that we could figure out how to do was to join a protest, or we could never figure out the right thing to say to stop a policy like family separation or a policy like the Muslim ban. And then we were bringing our skills and our talents and our judgment to the work product of the US government and helping do all of this harm in a way that was either unlawful or technically lawful, but only because we had worked to make it so. And so I was responsible for that.
And that must have been hard for you.
That was extremely hard. Now, I was balancing at the time this sense of who would replace me, and is it better? It's this age-old question, right? Is it better to work from the inside or to push from the outside? And at the time, even as I recognized my complicity, I also felt it was better to work from the inside. In fact, it was my duty to do so. I've come to see that differently, but that's how I considered it at the time.
You're now out of the Department of Justice. Yes. Where are you now, and what's this organisation focused on?
I now work for Protect Democracy, an organization whose mission is to prevent our government from declining into a more authoritarian form of government. I represent some Capitol Police officers who were hurt during the riots on January 6th as they seek accountability against former President Trump for conspiring and producing that violence.
Is Donald Trump an authoritarian threat to this country?
Yes, Donald Trump is an authoritarian threat to this country.
How so?
There's a playbook that authoritarians use. There are 7 plays that authoritarians or would-be authoritarians engage in to consolidate power and change a country from a democracy to an authoritarian state. Here's what they are. They aggrandize executive authority. They politicize independent institutions. They quash dissent. They spread misinformation. They target vulnerable communities. They corrupt elections, and they stoke violence. Donald Trump has engaged in all 7 of these. If Donald Trump wins another term, we will see some real shifts in our society. I think we can look to the leaders who Donald Trump wants to emulate. So that's Erdogan, that's Kim Jong-un, that's Xi Jinping, and the types of powers that they have and the ways that they quash dissent within their societies. And we will see an abandonment of the post-World War II order. Donald Trump has been very clear that he does not want to support NATO or other alliances that have been used to help preserve democracies around the globe.
Whether I can call it an institution or organisations perhaps that's helping him is this Project 2025.
Yes.
What do you make of Project 2025?
Back when Donald Trump came to power in 2017, Donald Trump did not have the full infrastructure to help him achieve his authoritarian goals. What has changed in the past 4 or 8 years is that now there is this broader authoritarian infrastructure. And Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 is part of this authoritarian infrastructure.
So these think tanks, whether it's the Heritage Foundation or what it's put together in Project 2025, should be taken very seriously.
We should take them extremely seriously, seriously and literally, as we now say. And we should, and I and my organization have, read through their promises and their plans and understand that this is their vision for America's future.
Project 2025 is actually recruiting people and vetting people. What can you tell me about that?
They have set out over the past few years to go ahead and create a list of people who they think will be loyal soldiers. Part of the genius of this, and give them credit where credit is due, is that in doing this, they have been very clear about what their expectations are for people who want high-level government jobs. And so they can enforce a type of orthodoxy on the political movement that would be hard to enforce otherwise.
Obviously, these people are vetted by Project 2025. What sort of questions do they ask potential appointees?
Well, I've got my phone right here. Let me read you a few of those questions. They ask potential appointees to say that they disagree with the concept that the gender wage gap is the result of prejudice and discrimination. They ask them to weigh in on whether the president should be able to advance his or her agenda through the bureaucracy without hindrance from unelected federal officials. And then they ask whether you agree that the federal government should recognize only two unchanging sexes, male and female, as a matter of policy.
So what do those sort of questions say to you about the sort of people that Project 2025 wants to recruit?
They want people who are unswervingly loyal to the Trump agenda, to his vision, and to him as a person, as well as to his and the movement's goal of subordinating those who don't look or sound like them. If we lose the expertise of all of those public servants who are coming to work every day and bringing years, if not decades, of knowledge, we're not going to be able to function as a society. That's extremely terrifying to me.
Donald Trump says one of two things he wants to do on day one, when he's going to be a dictator for that day only, is to drill. Have you got concerns about environmental policy?
I have extraordinary concerns about environmental policy, both because I have young children and I worry about the world that they grow up in, and because I look at the young voters today, the generation of kids who are, say, 18 to 30, and for whom climate change is understandably kind of one of their top priorities. They correctly recognize it's an existential threat.
And so what did you think when Donald Trump apparently jokingly said, I'll be a dictator, but for only day one only?
I thought that was a classic example of Donald Trump knowing how far to push the line to reveal how he understands the role of the president, which is he thinks it should be a dictator. And so he will move that window of acceptable conduct along so that next time he jokes about being a dictator for a week, people won't blink an eye. And then when he's actually something closer to a dictator for 4 years, we'll say, we saw it coming.
But would America and its institutions permit him to be a dictator for any day of his presidency?
Members of Congress have talked about how they take votes out of fear for their safety and their families' lives rather than because of what is right. And so the combination of fear, of hopelessness and resignation, and of a sense of disempowerment will allow Donald Trump to make a pretty strong headway in his goals of being a dictator.
Let's talk about the importance of the civil service.
Our civil servants are spread throughout the country. In fact, about 80% work outside of the broader DC metro area. They are our democracy in action. They are politically very diverse and diverse along other axes as well. Most civil servants understand that their job is to protect and defend the Constitution, faithfully execute the laws, and work with the political appointees to help deliver on the president's agenda in a way that is lawful and constitutional. And that's really, really a key constraint. What Donald Trump wants is our political stooges who will be loyal not to the office of the president, but to the person of the president and whatever his dreams or whims are.
What do you think Trump would do to the Department of Justice, your old department, if he's re-elected?
Donald Trump has promised that if he becomes president again, he would harness the Department of Justice to go after the people he perceives as political enemies or as somehow disloyal. And this is really, really terrifying because the Department of Justice holds what I think of as the most awesome power, this awesome domestic power that the US government has, which is the power to prosecute people for crimes, to harass them with investigations, even if they don't move forward with prosecutions, and ultimately to throw them in prison. And to use that power to enact political retribution, to quash dissent, would be to transform our country from one of rule of law to one of autocracy.
Lawyers in the Department of Justice are civil servants. What do you fear for your former comrades or the people who are lawyers in the DOJ now if Donald Trump is president again?
I really worry that my former colleagues will be harassed, will be fired, or will be co-opted, sometimes just because they have to provide for their families and are working to maintain their jobs and their careers. But the result of that could be extraordinary abuse of authority.
He has indicated, as I said, that he wants a special prosecutor to look into Joe Biden should he win the presidency. Is it too far-fetched to suggest, or too much of an Orwellian vision to say that there could be political show trials under President Donald Trump Mark II?
I certainly expect there could be political show trials under Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a showman. There is nothing he loves more than a reality TV show style assertion of power. The question is whether our institutions, those attorneys at the Department of Justice and our judges, will be strong enough to prevent that from happening. And I think that's really an open question right now.
Do you think he could either pardon himself or shut down investigations or cases against him?
We all expect that he would pardon himself.
Yeah, what do you think when Donald Trump calls the January 6, let's call them insurrectionists who've been convicted and sent to jail, when he calls them hostages?
These are people who have been convicted of engaging in some of the worst crimes that you can engage in a democracy, which is to obstruct the peaceful transfer of power. So they are not hostages. They have been afforded due process and convicted of crimes. But what I think he is doing there is sending a signal that he is going to have the backs of anyone who engages in political violence on his behalf. That terrifies me. That should terrify everyone.
Yeah, just looking at America under Donald Trump Mark II or 2.0, is it something you've truly believed that, America could be on the path to autocracy or authoritarianism?
I do. I truly believe that we could be on the path to authoritarianism. It is hard to close my eyes and imagine what that America looks like because it feels so distant from the America that I've known. But I'm also aware that we have a deep authoritarian strain in this country. We were not a true democracy until the Voting Rights Act was enacted in 1965. It is not an accident that Donald Trump's political rise coincided with the election of our first Black president. And so I think in addition to looking around the globe at the societies that Donald Trump wants to emulate, that he admires, we can also look to our own history to imagine what an authoritarian vision of America could look like. One of the things that we have heard again and again from experts around the globe is that authoritarianism is contagious. That authoritarianism in one country informs and inspires authoritarian in another country. But this also means that democracy is contagious.
So is that a fear that if Trump wins the next election, we may see a rise of authoritarianism across the world?
Absolutely. I think that if Trump wins the next election, that will legitimize authoritarian movements. I think it will free up funding and support for authoritarian movements through Donald Trump's foreign policy, which is very authoritarian sympathizing, right? And the things he has said about Russia, for example, are a great example of that. But it'll also mean that we're a role model for those right-wing authoritarian movements, for how they can take a democracy, co-opt it, and turn it into an authoritarian exemplar.
There is a lot of disillusionment about Joe Biden and how he's performed. As an individual, as a voter, what do you make of his performance?
In my view, Joe Biden's been a good president. He isn't perfect. There are things I really agree with him on. There are things I strongly disagree with him on. That's part of how democracy works. And part of what I worry about is that the stakes for our democracy have felt so existential for such a long time that other extraordinarily important issues have had to take a back seat, and we haven't been able to address them as a society or confront them as a society.